Thank you so much.
This conference will now be recorded.
You may begin the meeting, Dr. Schottenstein.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. The FSMB Recommendations Review Committee will come to order with the following members present: Dr. Rothermel.
Present.
Dr. Safran.
Present.
Mr. Giacalone.
Yes.
Dr. Feibel.
Here.
And myself, Michael Schottenstein. May I please have a motion to approve the January 13th, 2021 minutes as drafted?
So moved.
Thank you. I heard Dr. Safran and Dr. Rothermel all in favor, aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. The agenda for today is to continue our prior discussion regarding the addition of a public member to the complaint process and to additionally review the quality assurance recommendation. Staff has been kind enough to provide us with additional feedback. Stephanie, do you want to jump in at this point?
Sure thing. So the memo that you have before you, we've delineated into the discussion about the addition of a public member to the investigation review process, and then the second part about the quality assurance committee idea. So what we have laid out before you today with respect to the public member is first the statute section that we would need to change to add the public member in. And then I think, we can draft accordingly. I think we need to have more discussion about the additional points in the memo before we come to you with sort of a draft idea and in a kind of a strategy of going forward with that. I think probably the real crux of the discussion today is relative to what types of, if you all decide to add a public member in to the process, what types of complaints get reviewed by the public member and at what points of the process. And I think some of those answers will actually influence the decision making or the drafting of the language. In your packet, you have some data relative to the complaints that we reviewed over the last year or so, and kind of broken down by category. You can see that every year, where our sexual misconduct allegations are broken out first, and then we have the on, I think it's page 3 of the memo. I'm sorry, I do not have the page numbers listed, Ms. Montgomery. I know that makes you nuts when I don't put page numbers on. I apologize. I will do better next time. On the 3rd page, we break down the top 5 allegation types versus sexual misconduct each year. So you have a sort of a big picture on that 3rd page of the types of allegations that we're dealing with. The difficult thing for us to portray to you is that multiple allegations category, right? And that's unfortunate because it is the biggest category. It is so varied. We would have pages and pages of data on all of the different variations of data. So I just acknowledge that that's sort of a difficult look when it comes to data. And then you can also see on then the next page the types of allegations that are closed versus sexual misconduct cases each year. Yes, Dr. Feibel.
Real quick, on the multiple allegations, is there a way we could take out or at least separate out the sexual misconduct, those that have sexual misconduct in them? Because that would help us with numbers to try to see what we might want to have the consumer member do, if not everything.
Yeah, I actually think above that graph we have that it's labeled sexual misconduct allegations closed, and what we don't have is the submission, but I think we could do something similar to that. We have broken it out by. Oh, actually, the first graph on page 2, we have the sexual misconduct allegations submitted, and the orange bar is only sexual misconduct. The blue bar is sexual misconduct plus additional allegations. So in sum, you would have, let's say in the year 2018, some sort of sexual misconduct allegation in 110 complaints. In 2019, it was 119. and in 2020 it was 142. So we do have that.
That doesn't include, so up above is multiple allegations. So
Right. So for example, in 2018, of the 856 multiple allegation complaints, 36 of those were sexual misconduct, included a sexual misconduct complaint.
but what,
So I'm sort of pairing graph number 1 on page 2 with graph number 3 on page 3.
One on page 2.
We can render it better. I think we can just make it more clear of that chunk of the multiples what the sexual misconduct look like, because we then also have the 110 total below that.
so in the graph that we were just talking about, where there's 65 sexual misconduct cases in 2018, that really is 110. Is that right?
Correct. We had 110 with some sort of sexual misconduct allegation in 2018.
So that would mean, but by nature, that would mean that roughly probably half, a little less than half, have multiple allegations.
Correct.
Okay.
That's right. That's
So we're
exactly right.
looking at maybe 150 in 2020, roughly.
Exactly. 142.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Yes, Ms. Montgomery.
To what do you attribute the dramatic increase in this past year? Is that better reporting requirements, or to what do you attribute it?
I wish I had a good answer for you. I don't know. I could tell you my gut feeling is that we've been in the news a lot about sexual misconduct. And I would have to think that that naturally increases our visibility to consumers.
Okay.
Stephanie, does that reflect the Strauss additions too?
I do not believe that it does. No.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
Okay. So in terms of types of complaints, we'd had a discussion previously about how, in theory, certainly, I think we'd all really appreciate the idea of a public member being involved in the entire complaint process. But I think we also sort of landed in such a place as to say, practically speaking, because of the numbers, at least maybe we start with the sexual misconduct complaints and then potentially expand from there and just sort of, try that out and see how that goes. So is that sort of, with some additional time since our discussion, is that where we're sort of landing on that as a committee? Dr. Feibel.
Yeah, I personally, I think I mentioned this before, and I'd like to just say again that I'd like a consumer member to be involved in the entire process. I think it gives the public transparency on all of this. If we're not going to do that and we're not going to land there, I certainly, and it might seem counterintuitive, but I think that a public member should be involved in minimal standards cases too. And you might say, well, that doesn't seem right because they have no idea about minimal standards cases because it's a lot of technical stuff. But I think sometimes it's a lot of technical stuff and they can look at it and say, well, if all these doctors are saying there's a problem, maybe we should look at this again and figure out if there's really a problem. And I think that's a very important area that the public is trusting us to make sure. And I think it's an area that we as a board may not have had as many cases as maybe we could down the road. And I just think that would be another area that I think the public member we should start with if we're going to do sexual misconduct and minimal standards. I think that's important.
Thank you. Any other thoughts about that? Mr. Giacalone.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Feibel that in a perfect world, we should have a consumer member on all these. No argument. I think it's just a resource issue, like you pointed out, Dr. Schonstein. The minimal standards ones, again, I think challenging for a consumer member to look at those. At least I have a science background. I'm a little bit more in tune with it. But I think, even I struggle with sometimes having reviewed stuff when there's been a minimal standards issue and one of the secretary or the supervising members have been out because they've been conflicted. And it's difficult when you don't understand even the rudimentary sciences of medical diagnoses and whatever. And that's where I struggle. And I wonder if, putting consumer around there just doesn't give it the appearance of we've done our job, but we really haven't, which actually makes me a little bit more concerned. I might go with a different approach. I think sexual misconduct is definitely in. I think unprofessional conduct may be more in line with the consumer member's thoughts, because that's something that I think is more, I don't say objective because none of this is really objective, but at least it's something I think the consumer member can evaluate as a patient. With, did the physician act inappropriately? How did I feel in that regard? Whereas a physician reviewing that might be a little bit more biased and say, well, I was busy, this is the way it is, blah, blah, blah. So I guess if you had to add on when I'm not going to do, I would probably default more to unprofessional conduct as the add-on to sexual misconduct, as opposed to the minimal standards, which I think you're just going to have a lot of guesswork there, and I'm not sure it's going to be value add.
I think that all is fair, and I think that there are two potential thoughts, right, on that matter. One is, could the consumer member be helpful with the assessment itself? The other is, would having a consumer member as part of that process, how shall I say, move the process along a little bit better? We have these minimal standards cases that are years old, and so I think that is, I'm guessing, part of where that desire comes from is, would it be helpful to have a consumer member involved in that process as well, in the sense that potentially it would, pick up the pace and make it a more efficient process. Ms. Montgomery.
Thank you, Dr. Schottenstein. I agree with Dr. Feibel generally. Sure, I think that consumer members, in an ideal world, should be sitting there. We are 3 people, and I think it's important that we're able to speak in the public meeting. If the longer I am on this board, the more I respect the workload and the work carried by Dr. Rothamel and Dr. Safran and the time that they've had to put in. And I would, with all due respect, at this point, think we start with the sexual misconduct and perhaps limited specific kind of cases, perhaps where we have a protocol that says, this is a case we may need, maybe not say a category, but a particular kind of case, or a particular case that factually presents an issue that we say through a protocol, we ought to call it a consumer member on this one, only because we don't have the bandwidth. I think that to address Dr. Schottenstein's question, we have an enormous backlog, because we do, and there are lots of reasons for that. But it seems to me we're working through processes that in the next year we can see, I think, with Stephanie's help, that we are going to see a reduction of that backlog. Hopefully, I think that's a goal. And maybe we give ourselves a little time to see whether we can work through backlog, at the same time do specific review on, say, the sexual misconduct and or some particularly troublesome cases, and then come back and reevaluate it. We're obviously trying to invent the bicycle while we're riding it, and it's complex. If there's anything that Dr. Rothamel has certainly pointed out to me early on, is that I get tired of asking, why is it taking so long? Why is it doing this? And I think it would be very helpful for us to see if we can clear out some of this, because we've upgraded our processes.
Dr. Bechtel.
Yes, I think as having been the supervising member and secretary,
I do think it's important to have a consumer member being part of the sexual misconduct investigations. When we look at the ramifications of the Strauss investigation, the recommendations from the FSMB, I think that one of the really top priorities to institute as soon as we can would be to have a consumer member involved in sexual misconduct cases. Having been in those previous positions, it is a tremendous time commitment. It also is challenging to consumer members. And I do agree with Dr. Feibel that I think ultimately, I think the public wants transparency, and having consumer members involved at all levels, whether it be standards, minimal standards, or professional conduct, I think only is important. My thought would be to move forward with the sexual misconduct as soon as possible, and then to really look on a long-term basis, having consumer members involved at all levels. And there's different ways that you could do that. You could have maybe a consumer member involved with sexual misconduct cases only, so they only have to recuse themselves in those cases. You could have another consumer member dealing with minimal standards and just have to recuse in those cases. If we keep rotating every several months a consumer member, we'll have so many people recusing. And, we talked about maybe going back and seeing if that's necessary, but I'm just afraid it would be hard, maybe in some situations, to get votes. But I think that the sexual misconduct we need to move forward with. I agree with Dr. Feibel that transparency with a consumer member at all levels would be only worthwhile doing, but we need to respect the time commitment, and maybe if we want to move forward with consumer members looking at other areas other than sexual misconduct, we could look at maybe one member being assigned to minimal standards, one member being assigned to sexual misconduct and other things. So not everybody's being rotated, and we have a lot of recusals down the road.
And so if I may just sort of say that for my thought is that for that reason, when we go finally to draft language, right, regarding a public member, we should try to shoot for something as broad as possible. In other words, I would not want to have to come back and do this every time we decide one day, let's say, to expand the public member purview to other allegations besides sexual misconduct. Ideally, we would draft language that's broad, that just allows us to internally expand at our discretion. Dr. Feibel.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate all the comments, and I too often say it's easy for all of us to critique, criticize the secretary and supervising member sitting from afar as they're doing their diligent work, which is too all of us to do. So we do appreciate that, and this is not, again, any way a reflection on anyone who has been secretary or supervising member, but I do think. And I do appreciate their work as everyone else does. I do think there are a couple of things we can consider here. First of all, we're technically starting from a fresh slate. If the legislature will let us, we don't know whether they will or not, but we're technically starting from a fresh slate. So one option is to expand the board to have a fourth consumer member who is specifically hired for the specific role is to be the consumer member of investigations. And so it wouldn't take any of the public members out of the investigatory process, because I do have a problem with that. I think it's important to have three people who can opine on cases from the public. I think that's important. So that would be my rationale for doing that. I know Betty's shaking her head. I don't know exactly why. I'd love to hear, but maybe there's something I'm not understanding. But that person would be hired specifically for that. They'd have the time to do it, knowing going in that it's going to be a time-consuming job. If we didn't get that route, part of and I think Dr. Schottenstein hit it on the head, I don't think the consumer member is going to help with necessarily the adjudication of the minimal standards case, but I think they're going to help move it along. And I think as much as the Strauss case was so bad, I think we could have an equally bad PR issue if there's a minimal standards case that we haven't moved along quickly and we've kept that person on the streets, so to speak, practicing medicine for 10 years, knowing we had a minimal standards case. And some of these minimal standards cases don't come to us for 10 years. And I think that consumer member could help move along that process. And that would be less work for them because they might not necessarily have to be involved in every bit of the rounds on that, but they could be check-in points to make sure that this seems like it's taking forever. Why is this expert taking a year to review these records? That type of thing. And it would decrease the workload of that. And of any of the cases that the consumer member probably is least helpful with on the board level, and they listen to us for that when we talk about it, those minimal standards cases. So my thought is that taking a consumer member out of the voting process from the minimal standards case is a lot less than taking them out for unprofessional conduct. Unprofessional conduct usually is something that happened at the hospital. They were abusive to staff. They were things like that. They're not necessarily affecting the public who are going to them as patients. And I think that's what we really need to protect as much as possible.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments. You know, I have a recollection even of Ms. Montgomery saying to Ms. Canepa at one point, while we were having a discussion about minimal standards cases, why do we need a dozen of these, right? Why can't we have 5, right? Is there a way to sort of make the point, but, you know, in a way where it is a more streamlined kind of a process that moves it along a little more efficiently? Sorry, I think I saw a hand up. Mr. Giacalone.
Yeah, just to respond to Dr. Kleibel. You know, the consumer member is again great in theory, but we know kind of how this process works. It's a gubernatorial appointee. Usually, I hate to say this, you could have a political slant to it. Aside from that, no one as a consumer member understands the amount of work that is involved just being a regular board member, let alone the secretary or supervising member. They won't. I mean, and the only reason we know is because we are sitting on the board, have experienced it for a number of years. We know what it entails. We know the volume going on. So when you just say, well, we'll just put another person there, that person will be so overwhelmed, one of two things will happen. It'll be a half-assed job, or they'll leave and we'll have a rotating door of somebody that isn't going to figure out what the hell's going on. So quite honestly, I think it's a waste of time and energy to put that person in. It'll look great and it will serve nothing. It actually will probably be counterproductive. Now, secondly, on terms of the minimal standards, one thing I think we need to realize too is when the consumer member gets it on the board, that information is really fleshed out. You have expert opinion there. You're essentially spoon-fed the details. When you're the supervising member or the secretary, you have the raw data to assess. If it's difficult enough being spoon-fed the stuff, can you imagine what it's like as a consumer member looking at the raw data, not having a science background, and trying to assess what is a legitimate going forward on this? I think you're asking too much, quite honestly, in that regard. So I just reiterate, I think throwing minimal standards in there, while a great thought, I think is honestly, it doesn't serve any purpose. If anything, it makes it look like we did something and we really didn't. And secondly, I think, you know, the burden upon the consumer member in that, I think you're asking too much of them, especially given the background. And I don't think, honestly, if you get that 4th member, I think they will be overwhelmed. I think they will be will not be effective. Actually, they'll probably be a disservice to the function. Thank you for your thoughtful comments. And I would just say real quickly, and then I'll get to Ms. Montgomery, that the other thing about a 4th consumer member is then we have potentially need a quorum of 7, right? Yeah. I'm thinking at that point to get anything done. Kim, would our count in other words, would we have to go from 6 to 7 at that point? Or would we still be okay at 6?
I'd have to look at the statutes. You have a statute that says 6 votes for discipline. I don't think there's a statute that says quorum. I think we go from the rules of order that the board has adopted. So I'd have to look at that. I don't think it would change your votes for discipline, though.
Okay, thank you so much. Ms. Montgomery.
There may be a way to cut the baby in half here. Dr. Feibel, I think we can all agree that it'd be great to have all of us in an ideal world, consumer members do this. It may be that what you start with is sexual misconduct, and then, as I talked about, it may be that you want to say if a case is X number of years old and X in a certain category, that you bring us in, and that may trigger that will get to a great deal of what I think all of us want, but certainly Dr. Feibel has talked about. So I think if we let the staff think through this a little bit, I worry, like Mr. Giacalone, that a fourth consumer member, if that person is doing nothing but essentially being an addition to Dr. Rothmel and Dr. Safran, I don't know how often that person is going to be able to come, if they can, come up for air to be able to even engage at the board level without having to be recused. So that sort of ends the transparency, at least for the public, to see that there is a board member doing something on behalf of the public consumer, because they can't speak. They will only be speaking at the lower level, at the staffing level and at the process level, but not at the board level, because they'll be recused. I think that might be what the problem would be. So I appreciate us noodling this through, but I think there's some practicalities that we have to pay attention to.
So thanks very kindly. In the interest of time, I just want to move then to the review of the process. Stephanie had asked us to, weigh in on the public member role as well, in terms of where in the process they would, be involved, right? And so when I look at the graph about the review of process as shared at the October 2020 retreat, I see the dark blue shading where it notes secretary and supervising member involvement. I guess on the surface of it, my thought was that it would be at those points that we would potentially have the public member also involved. Any thoughts about that?
Michael, that makes
Yes,
sense.
sir.
That makes sense. That's what a secretary supervisory member interspace. It seems like that's what consumer members should too.
Okay.
Just going back to the legislation real quick. When we talk about if we move forward, we are going to make it not only broad enough to increase, potentially what's going to get reviewed, but also the number of consumer members, I think, is important too, because we talk about, are we going to split it between 2 consumer members or 3, or just having 1? I just want to make sure that the legislation reflects that it isn't just one person that's carrying all the burden on this. Sorry, that's it.
I think that's right. Thank you so much. Any other thoughts?
We nominate you, Bob, for the get-go.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate that.
If I may, Dr. Schottenstein, just speak to the process a little bit, and maybe secretary and supervising member would want to weigh in on here. I would encourage you to look at that process. And again, more coming from Dr. Rothmel and Dr. Safran's roles. I think there might be steps where we could question the value of being part of that. Like, let's say, for example, on the subpoenaing of records, there might be some more administrative tasks that I think where our goal is really to get that public member's view on how does the matter stay closed, or does it go forward to enforcement? So, and while seemingly not a big step, I think that they probably review a lot of subpoenas, and I don't even know the number, but I think it's in the thousands.
Wow. Okay. I take your point. Hi, Dr. Rothmel.
So, I think there's always a risk of sounding self-serving when you are in the secretary or supervising position, but I am truly not speaking self-servingly. I'm just trying to make a couple objective points here, because, as secretary, I'm willing to work with whatever rules we decide go into place, and I'll be fine with that. But I do think it's important. The discussion has been very interesting, and a lot of good points from everyone that has spoken. I was really sitting here pondering what Dr. Feibel meant from the public member being able to move along the minimal standards cases, and I think he clarified that a little bit. But I would like to say, number one, we have a huge number of minimal standard cases. That number is very large in the cases that we review. I think that the point Dr. Feibel made about maybe having a consumer member, have some say if they think the process is being drawn out too long and maybe shorten that process. But I would say respectfully that I think that borders on oversight of staff and the staff responsibilities. And I think it borders on a board member or the board being operational, which I don't think is our role. I do think that Stephanie and her team are really, really working hard at looking at everything to shorten up all of those processes, because all of us know that cases are taking longer than we want them to take. But I think they're working really hard on that. And the last point that I'll make is that I feel it would be very, very difficult to have a rotation of public members. It is a huge learning curve to start in one of these positions. It's a huge learning curve. And for us to expect that we're going to divide that up among 2 or 3 people and that they are going to just periodically jump in and have a handle on this, I don't feel would work very well. So that's it.
Thank you so much. I think it would be ideal if we had one public member who was sort of dedicated to it. I think that, again, it sort of comes down to, capacity. Any other thoughts then before we move on to QA? I actually had one other quick thought, unrelated to what we've talked about so far. You'll forgive me, I just don't want to forget to mention it. But when we look back at the beginning of the memo and we see the pie graph of complaints, we'll see that there are 2,533 complaints that are closed because these are complaints that are not under the purview of the board. Wow, that's a lot. And it, I just sort of wonder if there's a way to reduce that number, maybe with some guidelines, maybe for people who are inclined to register a complaint, for them to sort of go through so they can sort of self-assess as to whether or not the complaint is in our purview. I know there was a time when I talked to Tessie about that, and there's something in the, in the board complaint section on the website about here are things that we don't regulate. But just a thought in terms of, reducing some of that extraneous complaint, if there's a way to do that, in an efficient way. And obviously we don't want to either, accidentally give the wrong impression where somebody with a legitimate complaint would get the wrong idea. But if there's a way to sort of, trim that number down, that would probably be a good thing for all of us. So I just thought I would mention it. Any thoughts before we move on to QA?
I just 2 quick
Yeah, of
thoughts.
course.
Go ahead, Betty.
Are you going to skip over recusal?
That was my thought, Betty.
Oh, okay, sure. No, of course, I'm glad to talk about recusal. Do you have any thoughts for us, Betty, right now?
Oh, I think I expressed last time, I think that we are much too broad in our recusal process. With all due respect to Kim, Kim is protecting us in terms of not having it become an issue in an appeal process. But I think that we are being much too risk averse here. And I don't know, I think our recusal policy is too broad, personally.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, Dr. Feibel.
Along those lines, I completely agree. I think for instance, for Dr. Bechtel to have to recuse himself because he adjudicated a case on a person from 2010, and this case doesn't have anything to do with it, is certainly seems silly. And honestly, everyone should have the same rights under the board to have people hear their cases. And I won't be too specific about that, but I would like to explore, if we could, and I don't know if this is possible, but I think it's statutorial rather than anything else, why we need to recuse ourselves anyhow, why we can't be like judges and see all the stuff and still make an objective decision. Well, a judge is able to see everything, and they still can know what they're able to use and what they're not able to use. So if no one had to recuse, it would be, if it were legal, it would be better for the secretary and supervising member because they feel more a part of the board adjudication process. And I feel like I feel sorry for them because I feel like they have to just sit there mute and they can't talk. And I don't know if that's possible, but when I said way back when, I'd like to start from a blank slate and move forward, since we're having the legislature's ear on that. That's the kind of stuff I wanted to explore. Ultimately, is who has to recuse? Why do people have to recuse? Is there a way to legally set up a situation statutorily where we don't have to recuse?
We would need, I think, a statute change for that, because right now it's in the statute where it says, and I'll quote, "No member of the board who supervises the investigation of a case shall participate in further adjudication of the case." So we would need to change that statutorily. I think it would potentially be tricky for us if the secretary and supervising member were participants. Then essentially we would probably need outside parties, to come in to filter, what comes our way. I'm not sure we could, do it that way. I guess my thought was, though, also that we'd be right to take another look at the recusal process, in the sense that it seems to me that, if there's a complaint A and the board member has had, experience in terms of the investigation process of complaint A, they should be recused from matters relating to complaint A. And if complaint B comes in with the same licensee, but it's a matter that's still related to complaint A, it makes sense to me that they would still be recused. But if there are two independent complaints, if there's complaint A and then there's complaint B that the board member is not otherwise privy to, I don't think that we should have to recuse from complaint B. And I think that is the way that it is right now. Any other thoughts about that before we move on to QA? Okay, thanks very kindly. So looking then at quality assurance, Stephanie, do you want to jump in at this point?
Sure. Can we go back to recusal just quickly?
Right.
Yeah, can we go back to recusal? I'm just curious then, if those are the thoughts and we hear the desire to, we have to think through how we operationalize that, the commentary from the board. Is that something that you would like us to, it's not statutory, that's a matter of policy. So is that something that we would like to take to the full board for discussion? Is that something the committee wants to recommend? I guess I'm unsure what your direction is to operationalize that.
Well, so having heard our comments, I'd be interested first off in terms of a staff recommendation, because I certainly don't want to overstep myself and do something that's not comfortable for staff. But just sort of, hearing our thoughts, I'd be glad for you all to discuss it internally and then just sort of come back to us and say, yeah, this seems reasonable, or here's probably why I would not.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other thoughts before we move to QA?
Question about recusal. It's more of an operational question. What happens, let's assume we're down 2 or 3 board members and we've had a rotating secretary and supervising member, and all of a sudden we assume we have 9 board members or 10 board members. And I think for a while the board had 10 board members. Assume we have 10 board members and one person can't come, so now there's 9, and 4 people need to recuse themselves. What happens? Does that person
can't vote on the issue?
Nothing happens.
It just waits till the next week, next month?
Right.
Yep.
But if you have 6, you can vote on the issue, and 1 dissenting vote can knock the whole R&R out. Versus if you have 10, you need 4 to 5 dissenting votes to knock the whole thing out. Just
That's right. That's why it's always healthy for us to have a full board. Yeah. So maybe let's move to QA, if it's okay, just in the interest of time. Stephanie, did you want to start off with that?
Sure. So before you, we have, we were able to find the previous tools that were used by the former Quality Assurance Committee. And I think what we learned is that there were 2 types of complaints that they looked at. Just a random sampling of closed complaints. It looked like a 5% basis. And then they also engaged in what was called a focused review of closed complaints. And that focused review was when complainants asked for a complaint to be reopened. Then the Quality Assurance Committee would step in. My guess is that that focus review was only for select cases. I don't think that Quality Assurance Committee was looking at every case that complainants asked to be reopened. We get complainants asking for cases to be reopened all the time. I can't imagine that they looked at every one of those. So I think they probably picked select cases from that time period. It looks like the Quality Assurance Committee was in place for almost a decade, so from 1993 to 2002. And, I think what we need direction from is, what we could do is take the existing template that was used previously, do some analysis of that, and make some recommendations as to kind of what a tool could look like if a Quality Assurance Committee is put into place. I would note that, I think this is something that would be looked at as an investment of staff time, resources. And so it's really if we're going to do it right and well, we have to dedicate the resources to making sure that it's done right and well. And we get a lot more complaints now than we used to. So I think we'll have to be careful about the percentage that is picked and understanding how many complaints we're looking at relative to, what the capacity of the committee really is. What 5% might have looked like in 1993 might seem really high these days.
I wonder, do we have a number? In other words, we know it was 5% way back when. Do we know what that came out to?
I could probably go back through old data to find out how many complaints we received at that time period. I know we've just grown exponentially in complaints. Right. I can find that out to see what number that looked like.
Interested, because that may be representative of what they consider to be a manageable workload.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. And so anything else you need from us, Stephanie, in this matter?
No, unless there are, thoughts about process, procedure before we start, kind of coming up with something for you all to react to that looks a little more formal. If you have any thoughts before we dive into what that looks like.
The idea would be, I'm guessing, and let me know, of course, if I'm not seeing this right, that we pick a certain number, a certain percentage randomly, maybe computer generated, and let's just say for round number purposes, we have 500 closed complaints, and let's say we take 5% of those for audit, and that comes down to 25 cases, and let's say we have 5 members of the committee. So would it be then that each of us would get assigned 5 cases, and that we would fill out the form that presumably would come along with that case in terms of how we perceive the matter was handled, and then that would be sent in to staff prior to the following meeting, and then potentially collated by staff to present to us in terms of the number of cases, what kind of cases, what our findings were, that kind of thing. Is that sort of what you had in mind?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, it sounds reasonable. Anybody else have any thoughts about that? Okay. Any other matters then for FSMB today? Okay. Gosh, I thank you all very kindly for your thoughtful comments today. And I'll look forward to seeing you in another few minutes. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Dr. Safran, and
Second.
thank you, Dr. Rothermel. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thanks everybody. See you soon.
This conference is no longer being recorded.